Welcome to Creamer Media's Polity. I'm Shona Kohler. On June the 3rd, 2009, South Africa's President Jacob Zuma delivered his first State of the Nation address. With me in the studio is Ebrahim Fakir of the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa to speak about some of the implications of this speech. Ebrahim, one of the ongoing tensions that Zuma seems likely to face in his presidency is this need to balance the interests of business and the interests of labor. How do you think he addressed this challenge in yesterday's speech?
Well, clearly yesterday's speech went some way in addressing what I think the relationship between labor and business ought to be. But in doing so, I think President Zuma provided some detail and omitted to provide others. In doing so, the difficulty was that he's made a range of commitments, and let's just take two of them, which have broader implications for the relationship between business and labor. The first is the question of the protection of jobs, in that he made a very telling remark in his speech in which he suggested that those people who are at risk of losing their jobs, there is a social compact which has been concluded between labor, business and government, in which those people who are at risk of losing their jobs won't lose their jobs, at least not in the short to medium term, and that they would be given the option of being reskilled. Now, of course, that raises all sorts of questions around who is going to absorb the costs of keeping those people on and having them reskilled. There's no detail provided about that. He obviously did say that this agreement will be concluded in further detail as further meetings go on at NADLAC. But it does raise two important implications. Firstly, is that on the one hand, while government has made its commitment and has made a commitment about relaxing the regulatory framework in which small businesses operate, and of course has made grants available for further training and education and skilling, but it does not necessarily answer the question of who is going to absorb the cost of those people who will be retained and reskilled firstly. Secondly, it doesn't say clearly, because labor is not going to absorb this cost, it doesn't say overtly that the private sector is going to have to do so, but ultimately it's them who is going to have to sell not just the deal to, but the details of the deal, and that is they ultimately are going to have to absorb the cost. That's the first issue. The second is that he also made a commitment in which South Africa, he said the government's going to procure a greater amount of goods and services locally. Now that has very important implications for stimulating local manufacturing, light industry, all of the areas that they have outlined with respect to industrial policy. So that itself raises two implications. First implication is that if South Africa has been importing a lot of goods and services over the past decade or so, many of which it could not produce locally, realistically speaking, the commitment for government procurement locally is still going to be a bit of a pipe dream, at least for the medium term, simply because none of those manufacturing and industries are on stream. Coming up on stream is going to take at least a few months, and so before government's able to actually engage in that procurement process locally, it's going to have to wait a while. Now, obviously the identification of those areas, manufacturing, textiles, metals, light industry, automotive industries, the identification of those areas obviously heralds the fact that some jobs are going to be created in that sector. However, those jobs would only happen, I think, after a year or so, firstly. Secondly, what it does do is introduce into the economy degrees of arbitrage. And this arbitrage is that some speculators have already identified where the opportunities are going to lie, because those are clearly identified. Now, in a way, that's very good, but it does mean that other areas in which we require diversification, people are not going to invest either human resources or capital resources in those areas, and those are some of the areas which we need, not just for diversification, but also for the enhancement of the economy.
Can you speak a bit on the themes around which Jacob Zuma structured his speech yesterday, and whether his comments on these themes represent any sort of concrete direction for the country?
That is a very perspicacious question, simply because I think it comes on the back of much of this public debate which has occurred after his speech, in which there's one view which suggests that there was a lot of detail and no plan or no general view and trajectory of where we're going, and there's a second which says this sets a grand vision but doesn't have the detail. I'm afraid it's a little bit of both. And unfortunately, both of those views are, frankly, I think, quite wrong, because you're never going to have a speech which is going to have only detail and no vision, or a speech which simply has vision and no detail. That's the first point to make. The second is that let's also contextualize this. This is the man's first and his maiden speech as head of state. It's obviously a fairly emotional moment and a fairly emotional day. It's setting a trajectory. It also happens to have to set a trajectory within a fairly constrained global economic environment. And the fact that South Africa is entering a recession which I think is deeper than was thought to have been. So that's the context. Unfortunately, also, I think the way in which the speech was constructed, it really does touch on 4 key areas of development, but it doesn't come through simply because none of those areas are all codified within certain paragraphs or are not located in one place in the speech. But nevertheless, we can discern, I think, 4 of these elements. The first is in the question of economic development, and the economic development aspects relate to the social compact about protecting jobs, the creation of 500,000 jobs before the end of the year, a creation of a further 4 million jobs by 2014. So those targets were set out. There was then also in the economic development sphere the setting out of the industrial policies, the identification of the areas in which areas of concentration of focus will be. Those were listed, that were metals, automotive industries, fisheries and agriculture, light manufacturing, textiles, and there's a few others. So those were all the economic development aspects of the speech. There was then the state development aspects of the speech, and the state development aspects of the speech related to the question of creating a single public service. There's obviously open questions about whether the single public service is going to relate simply to norms and standards in employment behavior, or whether they're also going to relate to performance indicators. And clearly, I think if it's going to relate on both streams, they will have to be very clearly codified, simply because, the standards for performance at local government are going to be very different from the kind of standards expected at national government. But nevertheless, that's included as part of the state development enterprise, I think. The third area in which the state enterprise and development was focusing on was the question of increased and enhanced capacity, efficiency and effectiveness in the public service as a whole. And lastly, the question of monitoring, evaluation, performance management, which relates to the Planning Commission. Unfortunately, on the Planning Commission, there wasn't too much detail. There was no real detail about the role, the function and the mandate of the Planning Commission, simply because I think that there is no consensus within government at the moment about what the role, function and mandate of this Planning Commission is. And part of this negotiation is going to have to look at 2 things. One, is it going to have an overtly political role in terms of setting targets instead of setting standards, the number of jobs must be created, economic performance in certain sectors, and whether some ministers are going to feel that this Planning Commission, particularly in its political role, is overstepping the mark in terms of impinging on what is in their mandate, role, function and responsibility. So I think part of the problem here is political, part of it is practical, and there's no real consensus about the role of the Planning Commission, which is why I think, frankly, we didn't hear too much about it. So that is then with respect to the second area of state development. The third area was a reference to social development, social capital and social cohesion, and this related to the themes of people helping each other through difficult times, neighbors helping each other, stemming the tide of crime, getting people not to buy stolen goods, unity in diversity. So it was rehashing and re-envisioning the vision of Mandela. And I think that was the area of social development, which also included obviously questions of social welfare and transfers, and how social transfers are linked to economic opportunities and job opportunities. So that's the area of social development. The last area which brings up the rear was the question of political development. And political development was about the new relationship that he wishes to forge, firstly with opposition parties, and secondly with creating a greater space for civil society actors to participate in policy making. And COSATU obviously here seems to have taken the lead and have seized on the opportunity. So those, I think, are the four broad areas within which he's codified the speech. Of course, they peppered all over in very many different places. One has to pull them together to discern these themes. But that largely, I think, was the focus. I think a nice way of encapsulating the whole trajectory of the speech was that I think it tries to rely on the vision of Nelson Mandela, but bring in the policies of Thabo Mbeki. And it's quite telling that he began the speech by saying there's going to be lots of continuity. And continuity is both about the vision that we set in 1994 and the policies that Mbeki incepted for transformation of the society.
Thank you, Ebrahim. That was Ebrahim Fakir of the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa, speaking to Polity about President Jacob Zuma's State of the Nation address.